I've been on over a dozen 1,000-mile road trips between Southern and Northern California in my Tesla Model 3 Performance and never felt a whiff of range anxiety. But I've recently spent a week with a new EV, and over a 1,000-mile road trip, I was about stranded between charge stations at 1 in the morning. So let's just say that I have a newfound perspective on electric vehicle range and charging. Also, with my Cybertruck reservation and my hands-on experience with the Ford F-150 Lightning, we should probably talk about EV towing as well. I've built a model to fully explain all of this, so get comfortable because you're going to want to stick around till the end. So, what kind of real-world range can you expect in an EV? Are EVs seemingly less capable when it comes to towing? How much longer would a road trip take in an electric car? These questions definitely deserve a deeper dive here on Two Bit da Vinci. Special shout out to Keeps for sponsoring this video. If hair loss has got you down, keep the hair you got with Keeps. At the end of the day, we have to remember one thing. The internal combustion engine is as good as it's ever gonna get. Compared to EVs in their infancy, we'll look back decades from now, vaguely remembering a time when EVs only got 300 miles of range and required 40 minutes to charge. Let's talk about the underlying issue of energy storage. According to the EPA, a gallon of gasoline stores about 33.7 kilowatt hours of energy. In comparison, my Tesla Model 3 Performance has a 75 kilowatt hour battery pack. This means the 1,000 pounds of batteries on board my EV hold the same amount of energy as 2.2 gallons of gasoline, which weighs just 14 pounds. Okay, so slow down. I know what you're thinking. There's more to this story. For starters, gasoline engines are terribly inefficient, only able to convert about 35% of the energy in gasoline to useful energy to move a vehicle forward. The remaining 65% is wasted as unburnt fuel, noise, and largely heat. In comparison, electric vehicles are over 85% efficient. You can look at this in two ways. Gasoline is shockingly energy dense, and it's no wonder it has proven to be the fuel the world runs on for over a century. But interestingly enough, an EV delivers over 300 miles of range with just the equivalent of 2.5 gallons of gasoline. Gasoline, shockingly energy dense. EVs, shockingly energy efficient. To better understand why it takes so much energy to power a car, let's break it down into 5 categories and see how gas cars and EVs are affected by 1. Air resistance or drag, 2. Rolling resistance, 3. Towing and hauling, 4. Changes in elevation, and 5. The weather. I've come up with a model for gas and EV cars to help illuminate how these different factors affect range. So if you stay till the end, you too will have a clear understanding of these differences. First, let's validate our models and equations based on EPA estimates with a Ford Explorer and a Tesla Model X. Let's reverse engineer the forces at play if we assume that the Ford Explorer gets 20 miles a gallon at 65 miles an hour. If we assume nice weather, no changes in elevation, and no towing or hauling, which leaves just the air resistance and rolling resistance. Air resistance, or drag, represents the force needed for the car to move through the air and push air molecules away and around the car. This can be represented by the following equation. So the force of air drag is equal to 1/2 times the drag coefficient times rho, or the air density. We'll assume sea level, times the velocity squared times the frontal area. To understand how these forces will act on our cars, let's look at a good old force body diagram. Here the force of air drag acts in the opposite direction of travel. Let's assume an identical frontal area for both the Model X and the Ford Explorer. But the Model X is far more slippery, with a drag coefficient of 0.24 versus the Explorer's 0.4. You could go to engineering school for fluid mechanics and still be a bit confused about all of this, but let's break it down like this. The frontal area is how much car there is to move through the air. A motorcycle has less frontal area than a car, and a car has less frontal area than a semi-truck. The drag coefficient, then, is the aerodynamic design incorporated to make it easier to move through the air. Look at the Tesla Model X, and you can see the sloped profile is designed to move the air in the front and bring it back together in the back. In comparison, the Ford Explorer is optimized for interior cargo space and leaves a huge area of vacuum behind it. So the lower drag coefficient, the better. And things like airplanes, though pretty massive in terms of frontal area, have very small drag coefficients, since they taper to a near tip in both the front and the back. Before I get back to the show, let me take a quick moment and tell you about our sponsor, Keeps. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would someone like me, who's clearly blessed with a very aerodynamic noggin, be talking about hair loss? It's a good point. But did you know I once had hair?
True.
I wish Keeps was around back then because I used to use a leading hair loss product. But just as I had run out of my last bottle, I had a work trip and had to go 3 weeks without treatment, and well, the rest is history. With Keeps, you consult a licensed doctor online for the best treatment for you and get leading FDA-approved hair loss products shipped to you directly every 3 months. They even offer generic versions for better prices. I dreaded having to buy in store, checking out and broadcasting to the world that my hair was falling out. Short of surgery, it's really tough to grow back hair. But with Keeps and some diligence, you can keep the hair you have, which is why it's important to start right away. If you're one of the 2 out of 3 men that suffer from male pattern baldness, you have 2 choices: embrace it and let go, or fight back with Keeps. If this is something you're interested in, use my link, keeps.com/2bit, and save 50% on your first order and get started today. So the drag coefficient then is the reduction in drag via engineering design. And a value of 1 means you're basically pushing a rectangular box through the air. And a value of 0 means you've done the impossible, broken the laws of physics, and you've guaranteed yourself a Nobel Prize. One thing to note is that the air drag is a function of vehicle speed squared. So if you double your car speed from 40 to 80 miles an hour, you'll increase the force of air resistance by a factor of 4. Next up is rolling resistance, which is a little easier to understand. Rolling resistance, for the most part, is not affected by the vehicle's speed and can be expressed by this equation. Unlike a kilogram, which is mass, pounds is actually mass times gravity. So we can substitute the weight of each vehicle here for the normal force. Don't you just love imperial units? For once, actually, it is kind of more convenient compared to multiplying 9.81 meters per second squared times the kilogram number. Anyway, finally, the coefficient of rolling resistance is a measure of how much friction is experienced by the wheels. If we look at both vehicles with the following properties traveling at 65 miles an hour and find the work required for each force over 1 mile, we get the following values. The Ford Explorer has an air drag penalty of 241 watt-hours per mile and a rolling resistance of 59 watt-hours per mile. The Tesla Model X, with its more aerodynamic design, has an air drag of 144 watt-hours per mile, but being a heavier vehicle, has a higher rolling resistance of 69 watt-hours per mile. So using a total value of 300 watt-hours per mile for the Ford Explorer, and factoring that a gallon of gasoline has 33.7 kilowatt-hours of energy, we would get an expected fuel efficiency of 120 miles per gallon. But clearly the Ford Explorer isn't anywhere near that. For the Model X, at 213 watt-hours per mile, we'd expect its 100 kilowatt-hour battery pack to be rated for 470 miles, which again, clearly it isn't. So what are we missing? Well, it turns out this next bit is probably the biggest takeaway from this entire video. There are losses in efficiency that result from inefficiencies in gas engines or electric motors, transmissions, axles, differentials, and everything else. So if we expect 20 miles a gallon for the Explorer, we can introduce a back-of-the-napkin gas engine energy loss of 1.35 kilowatt-hours per mile. For the Model X, since we expect 300 miles of range at 65 miles an hour, we can introduce an EV energy loss value of 0.12 kilowatt-hours per mile, much lower than the gas engine. This is our first important point. The ICE car has so much energy loss from a gas engine, the need for a transmission, and everything else, that it dwarfs the effect of air drag or rolling resistance. For the Model X, EVs are so freaking efficient that the biggest energy loss is actually aerodynamic drag. This is why Tesla goes to great lengths to make their EVs as aerodynamic as possible, even if they do have to sacrifice interior cargo space to reach it. If our Model X had a similar shape to the Explorer and had the same drag coefficient of 0.4, then instead of getting 300 miles from its battery pack at 65 miles an hour, it would only get 233 miles of range. So now that we have backsolved this mysterious propulsion system energy loss factor, let's expand our exercise to account for hauling. When hauling, we'll assume you're not changing the aerodynamic properties since both SUVs would carry stuff internally. But if you have a pickup truck and are carrying a big refrigerator, then your aerodynamic drag losses would definitely increase. Our Explorer weighs in at 4,600 pounds and our Model X at 5,300 pounds. And if each hauled an additional 2,000 pounds, here's what would happen to their range. The Explorer would drop from 360 to 354 miles, a reduction of 1.7%. The Model X would drop from 300 to 278 miles, a 7.3% reduction. Again, the EV is far more sensitive to changes in weight on rolling resistance or speed on drag than the gas car because it represents a larger piece of the puzzle. Speaking of speed, what if we increase our speed for both cars from 65 miles per hour to 80 miles an hour and to 100 miles an hour? I'll list the range at each speed here, but for the Explorer at 80 miles an hour, there's a reduction in 8.3%, and for the Tesla, 23.3%. At 100 miles an hour, the Explorer sees a drop in range of 17.8%, and for the Tesla, 40.3%. Again, the EV is so efficient and has so little energy on board that it's vastly more sensitive to changes in either aerodynamics or rolling resistance. Next up is a category you've probably been waiting for. Let's talk towing. While we only applied a rolling resistance penalty to hauling, for towing, we'll apply both a rolling resistance penalty and a drag coefficient penalty, since while a trailer is out in the airstream colliding with air particles. For our towing exercise, let's put our speed at 55 miles an hour, a typical speed for towing. For our trailer, let's say it weighs 10,000 pounds and let's assume a frontal area of 36 square feet and a drag coefficient of 0.45. Not exactly svelte. These are just arbitrary values for a hypothetical trailer, but it should be fairly representative of a real trailer. In the real world, the drag of the trailer is harder to approximate because it is not colliding with standing air molecules, but instead experiences glancing blows from the car's airstream. So in towing, we'll simply add up the air drag and rolling resistance of the car and then that of the trailer and add them together. Doing so, we'll get the following values. At 55 miles an hour, the Ford Explorer consumes 1.58 kilowatt hours per mile, and the Model X, 0.292. The trailer consumes 0.378 kilowatt hours per mile. Adding the trailer to the two cars, we can already start to see why towing is so difficult for the EV. For the Ford Explorer, total consumption goes to 1.96 kilowatt hours per mile, a 24% increase in consumption. For the Model X, total consumption jumps up to 0.67 kilowatt hours per mile. And while that is still significantly lower than the Ford Explorer, it represents an increase of 130%. At these rates, the Ford Explorer's range drops from 360 to 303, while the Model X range drops from 300 to just 150. And therein lies the rub. The EV, as efficient as it is just carrying so much less energy on board than its gas brethren, and this difference looms large with hauling and towing. So we'll come back to this and why it doesn't necessarily mean the end for EV towing. But let's first look at other categories that affect range. So next, let's talk about changes in elevation and how it affects both kinds of cars. If you remember our model, the forces at play on our cars are simplified to be the force of air resistance, rolling resistance on the tires, and our special internal losses. But if you remember our calculation for rolling resistance, we actually made a simplification that we now need to address. We should probably rewrite this equation as follows. The theta here in this equation is the slope of the road. So on a flat road, theta would be 0 and cosine of 0 is 1. And that is why we simplified this equation when dealing with a flat road. However, as the slope increases, the rolling resistance actually decreases. And that's because the normal force that previously was acting straight down on the wheels now is acting in the direction of travel. Let's break down the normal force vector and see how it pushes down on the wheels, but then also acts against the motion along the road. By the way, all calculations are done using radians, but we'll be talking in degrees for better clarity. So as the angle theta increases, you'll see more of the normal force start to act against the direction of travel. If you've ever walked or biked uphill, you'll know even a slight incline really ratchets up the difficulty. The steepest grade you'll likely encounter is around 6%, which translates to 3.4 degrees. Rounded up, let's call it 4 degrees. So what if we update the slope in our model? Well then, here are the values for rolling resistance, air drag, and normal force at 4 degrees incline at 65 miles an hour. The Ford Explorer goes from 360 miles to 260 miles of range, just 72% of its original range. The Model X goes from 300 miles to just 103, only 29% of its original range. Pretty shocking, right? But what happens when you reach the top and you go back downhill? For the Ford, you see that the end result is a value of negative 0.338 kilowatt hours per mile. That means the downhill has a vector for the mass times gravity component, the normal force, that's in the direction of travel, and it's actually helping you along. So as a result, you're using negative energy. Unfortunately for the Ford, that negative energy can't be used to recharge or to regenerate gasoline, and instead, that amount of braking power will be required from either the engine or from the brakes in order to keep it from speeding up. In the case of the Tesla, it actually has an even better breakout of negative 4.26 kilowatt hours per mile, which is a huge amount of regenerative braking. And in the case of the electric vehicle, You don't have to use brakes or anything else. You get to just charge the battery right back. If we put a value of -4 degrees into our model, the Explorer goes up to 568 miles. But for the Tesla, it's so efficient that it actually gains 300 miles more of range. Yeah, a value of -300, meaning at the end of this trip downhill, you'll have had more range than when you started. In this regard, EVs are far better at towing. Because they're so efficient and have only one gear, you won't need huge transmission and engine cooling radiators to dissipate all that extra wasted heat. Electric motors are also vastly superior in terms of performance and also far more reliable and can easily last over 1,000,000 miles. Lastly, let's talk about weather and its seemingly significant impact on the range of EVs. One major difference between EVs and gas cars is that EVs need to create their own heat, which gas cars do not. I like to joke that gas cars are basically space heaters on wheels because they're so inefficient. But that wasted heat comes in really handy to heat the cabin. In fact, gas cars don't even really have any other sort of heating on board, unless it comes from things like heated seats or a heated steering wheel. My performance Model 3 has a resistive heater, while the Model Y and newer Model 3s have a heat pump, which uses far less energy to heat. If you're curious about heaters and heat pumps, check out this video we've made on our channel. You'll be an expert. So for the EV, being so efficient that there's nearly no waste heat, plus having a battery pack that needs to be heated if it's cold enough outside, the EV is especially temperature sensitive. Reports I've read claim that range can be decreased by as much as 30%, meaning a 300-mile range EV might only get you 200 miles if it's absolutely freezing outside. So that breaks things down into the categories that will have the most impact on range. So let's wrap this up. EVs and gas cars are both affected by things like rolling resistance and air drag, but changes to these parameters represent a much larger percentage change to EVs than to gas cars. It's like this. If you strapped honey badgers to the back of a cheetah and to the back of a buffalo, the cheetah is going to be struggling as the honey badger's weight represents a bigger percentage change, while for the buffalo, the change in weight is nearly negligible. Tesla in particular has reports that they might be overstating their range. Using rough numbers, a driving efficiency of 250 watt-hours per mile for a 75 kilowatt battery pack will get you 300 miles of range. I ran a poll earlier in the year to ask Tesla drivers what kind of efficiency they were getting. These results are mixed for all models, but over 27% of the respondents said that they were getting north of 300 watt-hours per mile. Using our friends at Tesla, who have millions of miles on thousands of cars, the results are as follows. On average, the most efficient car is the Model 3, getting 81% of its claimed range. That means 243 miles rather than the claimed 300, which is almost exactly what I'm getting. My performance Model 3 takes a decent range penalty, but did you know a big portion of that is actually the wheels and tires? I bought new EV-inspired aerodynamic wheels from a company called Fast EV. I like how they looked, but most importantly, they were a downgrade from 20-inch to 18-inch rims. This means there's 2 more inches of rubber for a far smoother ride, and also with the optional fairings, the overall wheel is far more aerodynamic. I did a test route around my neighborhood on the stock 20-inch rims traveling at 70 miles an hour. I averaged 262 watt-hours per mile, and the same trip on my new 18-inch aero wheels resulted in a value of 250, an improvement of 4.5%. To my Model 3 performance, that means about 14 more miles per charge, which on a long road trip is a welcome sight. I think Tesla's issue is that they're a little bit optimistic about range. They tend to overpromise and underdeliver, but it's really not by much, and for most it's not a deal breaker. Ways they could improve this would be to post city and freeway ranges separately, because your range is significantly different at 80 miles an hour than it is at 55. Companies like Ford are going to be far more conservative because someone buying a F-150 Lightning EV will be really mad if they aren't getting the 300 miles they said they would. For this reason, there are stories that Ford's range figures are actually while hauling 1,000 pounds. In case you're wondering, EPA ratings are a funny thing. The way it works is companies report a figure to the EPA, and unless it's wildly off, the EPA just approves that figure. So cars like the Porsche Taycan, which has an abysmal 200 miles of range from the EPA, can pretty easily do over 250 miles in reality. Porsche decided their drivers will drive more spiritedly, so if they expect 200 and get 250, they'll only be delighted. Underpromise and overdeliver. This is something I hope Tesla starts to do. But the good news is that EV makers are always finding new ways to cut energy use and improve efficiency, using heat pumps instead of resistive heaters, having all LED lighting everywhere, more efficient motors, and so on. But what about towing? Are EVs just doomed to never be able to tow? Not at all. I think in the future, special trailers for EVs can have their own battery packs, adding to the overall amount of energy on tap. In the case of the Model X towing our trailer, imagine it had a 100 kWh battery pack to bring the total for the whole car and trailer to 200. Then for towing, you'd get the original 300 miles as promised. Remember, adding heavy batteries will increase weight and rolling resistance, but it's still a huge victory for the EV. There are also companies like Polydrop that build a special trailer that is really aerodynamic to very minimally impact your range while towing. In fact, I met the CEO and owner at a recent charge stop I made, and he showed me the design and he actually showed me his data. And it turned out that he was getting about 555 watt hours per mile while towing the trailer at 55 miles an hour. So that kind of gives you an idea of how aerodynamic the car and trailer is and how well it's designed. So take a look around, we'll put links in the description. There are definitely things that you can do to still tow with your EV. So hopefully now you have all the information you need to fully understand the challenges with EVs, range, and towing. I will say today with our current battery tech, I think EVs are already great enough for almost everyone. If you tow huge trailers, if you live in rural areas with minimal charging infrastructure and you drive a ton, then yeah, maybe you should wait. But this is why energy density is so important and why so much research and development is going into the future of batteries. Companies like Tesla are pushing the boundaries of how we package batteries, going to structural battery packs where the batteries are part of the structure itself. The big battery companies are also improving on their chemistries, all in the interest of eking out a few additional miles per charge. Also, remember this, you charge your car in your garage or at your home. This means it's always fully charged up every morning. So really, most people who drive less than 200 or 300 miles a day will never have to worry about charging on the road or on the go. I live in San Diego and I drive to the Bay Area, a 500-mile trip one way. I've made this trip in my Tesla Model 3 over 12 times, and even once in a Volkswagen ID4. We usually charge twice in the trip. The first while we break for lunch, so 45 minutes or so of supercharging really doesn't delay us because we're eating lunch. The second stop, usually to charge, does hold us up for about 45 minutes or so. I'd say taking our Tesla on a 500-mile road trip currently will take 1 hour longer than a gasoline car would. But so what? We gotta stretch out and drive a car that's a dream to drive. Okay, so I hope that brings some clarity to this issue. I know there's lots of questions, and if I haven't covered everything, sound off in the comment section. I'll make a list and make sure I answer as much as I can. A huge thanks to our 2-Bit tribe, our community of Patreon patrons and YouTube channel members. Want to join our community on Discord, talk about future videos, and help write scripts and generally shoot the breeze? Check out the links in the description and join us as either a patron or a channel member. Also, take a look around. We have a lot of other videos we think you'll like. And until next time, I'm Ricky with Two Bit da Vinci, and remember, the future is gonna be awesome.